Hey, today we're going to talk about Paul's object lesson. This is a continuing study in the book of Galatians. We're in chapter 2. Last week we finished up chapter 1. And this morning you see in chapter 2, Paul starts out by saying this: Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. So this is 14 years. Some people would say this is that Jerusalem council that happens in Acts chapter 15. But in reality, more than likely, this is that instance in Acts chapter 11 when Paul literally takes gifts back from Christians to the church in Jerusalem. So it's been his second time in Jerusalem. As you remember in chapter 1, it ends up saying that after 3 years, he went up to Jerusalem. He spent 15 days with Peter, and he said, I didn't meet any of the other apostles but James, the Lord's brother. And so now it's 14 years later. So we can see that how realistic this is, that Paul did not learn from the early disciples because he's not there. He's not in Jerusalem. He's not around them at all. This is 14 years after this first trip that he talks about. So quite a length of time has happened here, and it's probably more than likely not that situation in Acts chapter 15, because he would have mentioned it a little more about the council and about how they had come out with this list of things, and this was it, that they didn't have to be circumcised, that they didn't have to do this or that, and the only thing was to abstain from blood and from idols and from sexual perversions, fornication, I believe is pretty much what's mentioned there in Acts chapter 15. Here he doesn't mention any of that, but Paul's main argument as he continues on here, he's basically just wants to let everyone know that this is not about works. So at this point, there's still people in Jerusalem, there's still Jews. It's coming out and saying you can be saved, but you have to be circumcised. So Paul is going to go back and he's going to talk to them about this, but he's taking an object lesson with him this time, and that is Titus. So he comes back 14 years later. He's got Barnabas with him, who traveled along with him a lot. And of course, by the Jerusalem council, Barnabas had left. So no doubt this is not that time of Acts chapter 15, because then Barnabas was not with him. If you'll remember, John Mark, who was traveling with them, left, and Paul said, well, I don't want him coming back. So when John Mark wanted to come back, Paul said, no, I won't take him. But Barnabas said, in my words, he said, well, no, he's still good for use. I think he can be used. And so Barnabas and Mark went one way, and Paul took Titus, and they went a different direction. But we see from that how the exhortation of Barnabas actually, how important that was. Because Mark ended up writing the book we know of as the book of Mark. And of course, Paul later on in his second writing to Timothy says, bring Mark. I mean, he's profitable to me. So Paul later on seeing how he should have kept Mark with him, how he probably should have continued to encourage him. Anyway, going back to chapter 2, it says, taking Titus along with me. So now they're going back to Jerusalem. They're going to make their case how circumcision is not necessary. And he takes Titus with him. So why would Titus be an object lesson? Well, it's because he's a Greek. Barnabas is Jewish. Of course, Paul is Jewish from the tribe of Benjamin. Learned as a Pharisee, so he knew the law backwards and forwards. And he has a Greek with him, someone who knew nothing really about the law other than what they were taught by people like Paul. It says he takes Titus along with him. And he says, I went up because of a revelation and set before them. So Paul was letting them know it's not because someone asked him. It's not because Titus said, let's go, I want to see Jerusalem. Paul says, no, I'm going up as a revelation from God. So God basically spoke to Paul, whether in a dream or just him praying, and he thinks, well, no, I need to go to Jerusalem. But he says, I went up by revelation. He says, though privately before those who seemed influential. Well, I think this is an important thing to realize about Paul here, because so much of what you hear about the Apostle Paul is that he would stand up and say, this is how it is no matter what. We hear that Paul would go out on the street and condemn people who were different than him. And in some instances, that is true. When Paul was at Corinth, he lambasted them with talking about how, you have this God set up to you and he basically was saying, you're wrong. and he would just come right out and say it to these people who were sitting there to listen in Corinth. But here, when he goes back to Jerusalem, and he's with these influential Jews, namely Peter, James, and John, he says, I went back privately to them. And the reason is because Paul wanted to keep it under wraps for now. He did not want this huge argument to get out with these influential Jewish people. So Paul did not go back, at least in this instance. Now, Paul was willing to stand up to Peter, as we'll see in the next lesson, but at this point, Paul is just like, I want to try to keep the peace. I want to go back just privately to these few people, that I don't want this all getting mixed up with everybody. I want to just try to get this settled and do it in a private manner at this point. He didn't want to do it out in the courts of the synagogue. No, he said, I just want to do it privately. The gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. So this is the reason he wanted to do it privately. He said, I don't want all this work I'm doing to be in vain. In other words, Paul wants to minister, to witness to these Jewish people, to let them know they do not have to be circumcised. They do not have to keep the law. And if Paul went back with guns a-blazing with Peter, James, and John without just sitting down and talking to them, then he could have ruined all the work that he had been doing. He could have ruined this and made it be in vain. So he wanted to go privately. He wanted to sit down and talk to them, and he wanted to get this worked out. And this is what he says in 3. He says, but even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. So because Titus was Greek, he did not have to be circumcised. Paul's rationale here is that you do not have to be circumcised. A lot of these Jewish people were saying, well, people like Titus, who were Greek, could be saved, but they had to be circumcised. In other words, they had to keep the law of Moses. The circumcision was just kind of a broad statement for saying you have to keep the law. And so this was an outward physical thing that they would do in order to show that they were keeping the law. And they're saying, this is what you have to do. And Paul says, look, I have an example with me, this object lesson, so to speak, and this is Titus. He's saved. He's for the glory of God. The Spirit is upon him, but he's never been circumcised. Now, there are some that would say this is a contradiction, because if you're reading through and studying about the life of Timothy, who was half Greek, half Jew, he was compelled to be circumcised. And Paul literally encouraged him to go through the circumcision. The reason was because he was half Jewish. And Paul felt best that Timothy would go through with the circumcision so that he would be better able to witness to the other Jewish people. But in the instance of Titus, he never encouraged that, and in fact uses him here to prove that he could be filled with the Spirit and never be circumcised. So he had never gone through the law, so to speak, of Moses by being circumcised. And said, yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. A couple things here. Number one, he refers to them as false brothers. Now, the reason he calls them false brothers is because they were teaching a false gospel. Now, understand that this false gospel was not about how they dressed. It wasn't about what time they went to service. It wasn't about whether they had a building to worship in or whether they were by the side of the river. The false gospel was about how they would be saved. They were teaching this false gospel that they were to be saved by keeping the law, that they had to be circumcised. This is the gospel that they were teaching. So after pointing that out, it's important to also notice he still refers to them as brethren. So here's a question, and I've studied this. I'm not real sure whether Paul is just using this language and saying they're not saved, or he's still referring them as brethren, but they have a false gospel that they're teaching. So is it possible to be brethren and still be teaching this works in addition to believing in Jesus Christ? I don't think that goes against what Paul teaches other places. So I kind of believe he's referring to this in a sense of saying that they're false brethren. In other words, they're really not brethren at all. It's kind of how I feel like he's saying this. When you put the scripture together with all of Galatians and other books that Paul writes. But if you have any other thoughts on that, put it in the comments. Love to hear from you on that. But he refers to them as false brethren. He said they secretly came in. So in other words, Paul wanted to go there. He wanted to go there privately. He wanted to go there without everybody knowing. But they came in. They kind of slipped in. And they did this to bring them into slavery, as he refers here in the ESV. In the King James, it refers to as bondage. This bondage was that they had to keep the law to be saved. Paul's whole issue is that the gospel of Jesus Christ, the one he said, you have to believe this, even if I say something else or if an angel from heaven would come in and say anything else, still understand that the gospel is the belief in Jesus Christ. It's by faith through grace in Jesus Christ. It has nothing to do with what you have done. It's by faith in Jesus Christ. The bondage was to say, no, you have to be circumcised, you have to do this, you have to do that. This is all the whole letter. It's what Paul's arguing, and it will get better as you go on through the book here. He said, but we did not yield in submission, even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. So Paul's saying, even though these people came in, they were preaching this other gospel that you had to do works. He said, we did not listen to them even for a minute. In verse 6, and from those who seem to be influential, referring to Peter, James, and John, and the others, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seem to be influential added nothing to me. So this is classic Paul. Paul goes back, he wants to go back kind of privately and sit down and talk to them, but he says, it doesn't really matter to me what they say. It's not going to make a difference in what I believe, but I really want to work this out for the furtherance of the gospel. I want to influence them. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. But he said, it really doesn't add anything to me. Verse 7, on the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised. So they're seeing the difference here. Peter, you see how Peter understands that you did not have to be circumcised in Acts chapter 10. And this story where he went back is probably Acts chapter 11. But he said, they sent Peter out to the circumcised. I'm more of a evangelist to the uncircumcised, which is to the Greek, to anyone who's not Jewish. Verse 8, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. So Peter's going to the Jew, and Paul is going to the non-Jew. Now obviously Paul preaches to Jewish people quite often, as you see throughout the book of Acts, and he would go on the Sabbath day. He did this for week after week after week in different cities. He wanted to witness to the Jewish people, but he felt like he was sent to the Gentile people. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, is verse 9, perceived that the grace was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. So this is what Paul wanted. He wanted their hand of blessing on him so he could continue his ministry, so that he and Barnabas and Titus or whoever could continue teaching the gospel of faith by grace in Jesus Christ. This is what Paul wanted. He just wanted their hand upon them to say, okay, you can go, and we'll give you our blessing. But Paul said, as we just read a verse or two back, it doesn't really matter whether they do or not. I'm not changing the gospel, because this is the gospel that was given to me by revelation of Jesus Christ. It is the real gospel, and it's the only thing that matters. And I think this is kind of an important place to end on. In verse 10, it says, only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing which I was eager to do. So this is one thing that I have kind of pointed out time after time in recent weeks. The thing that matters, the thing that I don't see churches particularly do it. Now some do it better than others, and all of churches would probably say, yes, we do this. But how much are we really doing this? This is the one they said, Paul said, they gave me their blessing to go preach to the Gentiles. But this one thing they said, please remember the poor. And this is where the whole gospel that Jesus taught, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself. To be good to the poor. We see this throughout even the Old Testament, that they would glean from the corners of their field and leave that for the poor, what the corners for the poor. We see it time and time and time again. And I've made this statement, and I'll say it again. It's so sad to me to see these empty, huge church buildings sitting corner after corner on street after street and town after town, at least through the eastern United States in the Bible Belt. We see them setting, and they are used, some of them only an hour a week. Some of them would be used more. But how many homeless and poor people could we help? Number one, by just letting them use our buildings. And that may seem really odd to some people, but just consider thinking outside the box. We have homeless people all throughout our nation, and we have these empty buildings sitting around that's not used, and we're supposed to be reaching them. And instead we feel like, well, they may make our place of worship dirty. But Jesus said it's not about a place. It's not about that building. And how much more could we do? Or consider the money that goes into the building. Let's say you didn't want to have a building. The money that you could use to reach the poor, to help them. As Jesus said, as the early disciples said, this is the only thing I want you to do is remember the poor. How much money could be given to help them if we weren't paying huge salaries, if we weren't paying for this huge building, this immaculate place to go and worship in, so to speak? And I think these things are important to an extent, but I think we have put way too much emphasis. The church of today cannot think outside of the box at all. Our gospel so often is that you have to go to church, at 10 o'clock for Sunday school or at 11 o'clock for service. You have to go week after week after week. It's important to get together with believers. That is encouraged time after time after time. But we are so stuck in our box that we cannot think outside of doing it exactly the way we have seen it week after week, month after month, year after year. And the early disciples did not believe that. And they said, this is what's important. Remember the poor. This was how they would reach them. This is how they would show the love of Christ, by remembering him. And Paul ends it by saying this, I was eager to do this already. So Paul's saying, they encouraged us to do this, but they really didn't have to, because we were already planning to do it. We were already trying to reach the poor. We were already trying to be good to them. Paul was worried less about getting his check, so to speak. Paul, he received a lot of help from different places, different churches. He talks about that at different places in his writings. But he also said, I didn't want to be you don't have to be in any obligation to help me. At one point, it even refers to Paul, how he worked as a tent maker. I believe this is how he met Priscilla and Aquila, because they were of the same craft, and no doubt he worked alongside with them. And so in other words, Paul's main ministry, he wanted to do everything he could to help the poor, to help be the light to others so that they might see Jesus Christ. How much should we think outside the box to try to reach people in need? What should we do differently? If you have any thoughts, please put it in the comments. Please let us know what you think, because I am fully believing, as I've studied, as God's dealt with me over the last several years, that what's important in our ministry we're not doing, because we cannot seem to think outside of the box. We have created our own gospel, so to speak. Yes, we're teaching, a lot of our churches are teaching salvation by grace through faith, but we put these stipulations on it. Just like these early Jewish people were putting stipulations on it. Their stipulations were that you had to be circumcised, that you had to follow the law of Moses. Well, a lot of our churches don't teach that, but they do say, well, you have to do this. You have to dress this way. You have to go to this service. You have to give this amount of money to this project. And you have your own little gospel that's being taught inside of this gospel of belief in the Lord Jesus Christ. So what's important? Who are we helping? Who are we trying to reach? Because a lot of our church services, a lot of our gatherings just seem to be patting each other on the back. And that's good to an extent. We need that. But don't stop with your little meeting being of patting each other on the back. Take your gospel and take it hour after hour throughout your week and try to reach the poor. Try to reach the needy. Try to reach the widow, the orphan, those in need. As James said, this is pure and undefiled religion to do this. Paul talks about it time after time after time. And we fail to see the importance of it. So for today, we'll stop there and continue on next week. But please continue watching. If you're enjoying the content, subscribe, and so you can get up to date on when the next videos will come out. Thanks for watching.